Inside a closed-door meeting, the fate of a loyal dog is decided, without a single bark in his defense. There are stories that haunt our quiet streets, stories of tested loyalty, nearly lost hope, and an act of kindness that changes everything. But have you ever wondered what happens to a hero when the world turns its back on him? This is the story of a wounded German shepherd and the grieving officer who refused to let him be forgotten. Stick with me until the end, because the miracle that unfolds in this town will make you wonder what it really means to be seen, to be saved, and to never give up. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances, type "I'm here for Scout" in the comments below. Don't look away. This is a story you'll carry with you long after the screen goes dark. Morning in Pendleton always arrived slow and tentative, the winter sun little more than a pale suggestion behind the mist rising from the hills. The grasslands east of town lay brittle and silvered, their blades beaded with frost, stretching endlessly toward the folded blue of the Umatilla Mountains. Here the world seemed paused between memory and forgetting. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, everything shaped by weather and time. On these mornings, Frank Weller drove the police cruiser with the windows cracked open, just enough to let in the bite of cold. His hands, broad, lined, marked by the tremble of years, rested on the wheel, fingers drumming out a habit he'd had since his rookie days, long before the gray crept into his hair. The car moved slowly along the two-lane blacktop, tires whispering over the cracked road, past the grain silos, past the huddled brick storefronts with their faded signage and battered doors. Scout rode in the back seat, as he always did. 7 years old, the German shepherd filled the space with a quiet dignity. He was a large dog, dark fur brushed with smoky silver along his spine, chest broad, legs splayed in a way that made him look both powerful and tired. One eye, a pale, ruined marble, stared straight ahead, unfocused, seeing only the shimmer of lost light. The other eye, keen and golden, followed Frank's every motion through the rearview mirror, as if seeking comfort in the familiar. There were mornings when Frank spoke aloud, words drifting, half-formed, mostly for himself. But today, he said nothing. Silence clung to the inside of the cruiser, broken only by the low hum of the engine and Scout's steady breath, warm and rhythmic, fogging the cold glass. Pendleton, just waking, offered nothing but stillness. Frank turned off Main Street, making the slow, familiar climb up Cemetery Hill. The road wound past old sycamores, their trunks mottled with lichen, branches bare and reaching. Here, where the ground leveled out, gravestones hunched in the pale grass, worn by decades of sun and snow. He pulled the cruiser to a stop beneath a leaning pine. He didn't bother with the parking brake. Habit said he wouldn't be long. For a moment he sat, hands unmoving, watching his own breath cloud the air. Then he opened the door, the cold rushing in, and let himself step out into the gray hush. He stood for a long while beside the car, gazing at the rows of stones. His eyes landed on one marker, simple and unadorned, tucked beneath the arching shadow of the pine. Frank's wife had lain here nearly 6 years. Cancer had taken her quiet and quick, like a candle blown out on a windless night. He visited often, never with flowers. She'd hated cut flowers, said they always looked sad. But sometimes he'd bring a thermos of black coffee, pouring half into the ground just beside the stone. This morning, he brought only himself. Scout remained in the car, head resting on the seat, watching through the window. Frank's boots left twin marks in the brittle grass. He knelt by the marker, tracing the worn name with his thumb. He whispered nothing, asked for nothing. Grief didn't need words. It was a companion now, as familiar as his own shadow. From the car, Scout gave a soft, low whine. Frank turned, the lines at his mouth deepening. He walked back, opening the rear door. The dog stepped out, slow and deliberate, paws crunching frost. He pressed his head against Frank's knee, the old habit of reassurance, of being needed and present. Frank's hand, rough and cold, came to rest on Scout's neck, fingers moving in small circles. The dog leaned in, half-blind gaze lifting to meet the officer's face, sensing a heaviness that went unnamed. They stood like that, man and dog, side by side in the gray silence. Two survivors joined by something that went deeper than words. The town below, river and rail line cutting through its heart, was just waking to the world. Here time seemed suspended, but beneath that hush, another current moved, unseen, uneasy. Frank's thoughts circled the coming day, knotting in his chest. Today was the meeting. Today, a group of men and women, most of whom had never walked a hillside in storm, never seen a dog find a lost child in the snow, would decide Scout's fate. He remembered the letter, folded and creased, stamped with impersonal authority. Fitness for Service Review, K-9 Unit, Scout. He'd read the words in the dark, beside the empty side of the bed, hand shaking just a little. The decision was clear enough. The department needed dogs at their best. Scout, with his ruined eye and halting step, was now a liability. Frank didn't blame them, not truly, but he couldn't explain, not with words, what it meant to trust a creature that would walk into fire for you, or how loss could take up residence in a life, filling the corners with its silent ache. A breeze stirred, setting the pine to whispering. Scout shifted, pressing closer. Frank bent, brushing frost from the dog's muzzle, a small gesture, the only prayer he had left. In the distance, the river shone, silent and indifferent. The day had only just begun. The world, for a moment, held its breath. Memory has a way of settling into the body, more stubborn than the ache of old bones. As Frank steered the cruiser back down Cemetery Hill, Scout lay curled behind him, the dogs breathing low and even. But every so often, the shepherd would twitch, a muscle along the flank, a flicker in the one good eye, as if, even in the present, he could not escape what was etched deep beneath his skin. Pendleton's main streets remained hushed, a handful of cars angled along the curb, their windshields fogged by the early chill. Frank pulled into the station lot and sat for a moment, engine idling. He glanced at Scout in the rear view, and the dog lifted his head, waiting for a sign. The town was still, the bakery lights not yet on, the old bus lumbering through with its usual emptiness. Only the river, restless as ever, carried on below the bridge, half hidden in the lifting mist. Sometimes Frank thought of how easy it was to miss the turning points of a life. He could recall, in detail, the day Scout had been brought to the station. Little more than a bundle of wiry fur and nervous energy, paws too large for his body, eyes bright with the hope of being chosen. Over years, the two of them had become a team, wordless in their understanding. Scout was never the loudest dog, nor the most eager for praise, but he had a stillness that drew people in, a patience for the timid, an unerring nose for the lost. It was that nose, that unwavering devotion, that had made Scout the town's pride. There were newspaper clippings tacked to the station bulletin board, old yellowing photos of Scout and Frank together, muddy and wind-burned, standing beside children found safe after nights lost on the hills. People smiled at those stories, called them miracles, though Frank had never much liked that word. He knew miracles came at a price. The memory that returned now was sharp as winter. The night the storm came. The night everything changed. Pendleton's winters were not kind. The wind howled down from the blue mountains, lashing snow across the valley. That night, word had come of a missing boy, a child last seen near the cattle sheds north of town, vanishing into a curtain of blowing white. Frank remembered the radio static, the taste of iron on his tongue. He remembered the way Scout had paced the back seat, restless and alert. They searched for hours. The snow-swallowed sound dulled the beam of flashlights, filled every hollow and ditch. Frank stumbled, half-blind, boots soaked, calling out until his voice splintered in the dark. It was Scout who found the boy, collapsed beneath a drift, face ghostly with cold. The shepherd had dug with frantic paws, whining, barking once to bring Frank running. Together they dragged the shivering bundle to the truck, wrapping him in blankets, hands numb with relief. But on the way back down, disaster came quick. Somewhere above, a rock gave way, an avalanche of stone and ice. Frank saw it only in a flicker, the flash of white and gray. Scout lunged, pushing Frank aside, taking the brunt of the fall. There was a terrible cry, then silence. The snow was stained red, steaming in the cold. Frank dug with his bare hands, mind white with panic, until he found the shepherd, limp and gasping, blood pooling from the side of his face. He carried the dog for nearly a mile, cradled against his chest. By the time they reached help, dawn was breaking, sky the color of bruised peaches. Scout's eye was ruined, sight gone forever, the socket swollen and raw. They said it was a miracle Scout survived. The boy lived, the town sent cards, but Scout was changed. Recovery came slow and uncertain. The stitches held, the fur regrew over the scars. But something in the shepherd's bearing was different. He startled at sharp noises, paced restlessly at night. Worse, he lost his sense of direction in the dark, bumping into corners, hesitating at thresholds. The other officers watched with polite concern, but behind closed doors the doubts grew. Maybe it's time to let him go. He can't do what he used to. Best not to let him suffer. Frank heard every word, though few were said aloud in his presence. He saw it, too. The way Scout would pause at the station door, ears twitching, one blind side turned toward the world. He'd watch the shepherd in the yard at dusk, circling, nose low to the ground, trying to map a space that no longer fit him. Still, Scout fought to belong. He greeted every new morning with the same steadfast patience, waiting for Frank at the door, sitting quietly as the officer buttoned his uniform. He learned to trust the gentle nudge of a hand, the steady rhythm of Frank's voice. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world seemed most fragile, Scout would climb onto the worn rug by Frank's chair, curling his body close, seeking the comfort of presence over vision sometimes. Frank would find the dog wandering the hallway, bumping against the edge of the sofa, then correcting course with a slight shake, never complaining, never giving up. There was a grace in that, something wordless and dignified, a refusal to be defined by brokenness. And yet, the world was moving on. The letter from the department arrived, its tone final and cool. Fitness review, next steps. The staff at the station began to avoid Frank's gaze, busying themselves with paperwork, the business of law enforcement marching forward, indifferent to loss. It felt to Frank like watching someone close a door in slow motion, each hinge screaming with the weight of everything left unsaid. That night, Frank sat on the back porch, Scout at his feet, the sky spinning out stars above the silent hills. He listened to the steady, uneven breathing of the dog who had once saved him, and he tried to believe there was still time, still a reason to hope. But the scar, once made, would not fade. Not from Scout's face, not from Frank's heart, not from the life they had built, and now, threatened with unraveling, held together only by the quiet, stubborn love of one man and one broken dog. The day of the meeting came cold and colorless, the sky hanging low and heavy, swollen with unfallen snow. At the Pendleton police station, the lights were already on when Frank arrived, thin lines of fluorescence flickering against old linoleum, throwing his shadow long down the hallway. He walked Scout in through the rear door, where there would be fewer eyes. The shepherd's paws clicked softly on the tile, head held low, tail making a small, uncertain arc in the stillness. Frank could feel the animal's unease in every hesitant step. In the conference room, the table was already set, a dozen battered chairs pulled up close, the surface scattered with manila folders, coffee cups, and a plate of cookies someone had brought out of habit rather than hope. There was no laughter, no warmth. A faint draft seeped in beneath the window, stirring the dust motes above the carpet. Frank took a seat in the corner, away from the yellow light and the hush of official voices. Scout settled at his feet, pressing his flank against the worn leather of Frank's boot, a silent anchor in unfamiliar waters. The dog's one good eye followed every movement, flickering between the hands that shuffled papers and the faces that never quite looked his way. Others entered in pairs or threes. Chief Laramie, heavy-set and ruddy, his uniform stretched tight at the shoulders, nodded curtly at Frank, but did not smile. Beside him, Sergeant Vince Carney leafed through the case files, his lips pursed in silent calculation. At the far end, a woman from the city council, her name was Eileen Masters, small and sharply dressed, checked her phone, fingers drumming a quiet, restless rhythm. No one spoke to Scout. In other times, he would have been greeted with affection, a hand running down his back, a scratch behind the ear. But today, there was only the polite indifference of people bracing themselves for something uncomfortable. Beneath the table, Frank's hand found the rough patch behind Scout's ear, the fur still thin where the scar cut through. He kept his eyes on the grain of the wood, listening as the meeting began. Chief Laramie cleared his throat, voice echoing slightly. "We're here regarding K-9 Officer Scout, badge number 2741. The board will review the service record and the recent incident reports. The department veterinarian has submitted evaluations. The final decision will be entered into the record today." No one asked Frank to speak. Not yet. Instead, they recited the list of injuries, the diminished abilities, the cost of care. There was a quiet, bureaucratic efficiency to it all. Scout reduced to a line item, a liability to be managed. The words tumbled out, each one a small stone thrown into the pond of Frank's memory. Loss of visual acuity, left side total. Startle reflex, moderate to severe. Occasional signs of disorientation, especially in low light. Incidents of agitation reported by kennel staff. Someone read from the performance log, the voice flat, as if reading from a weather report. No longer able to participate in active search and rescue operations. No longer able to safely navigate complex terrain. Behavioral changes noted. Restlessness, hesitancy, reduced confidence. Frank listened, hands folded in his lap, thumb tracing slow circles over his knuckle. Every word landed like a slow bruise. Across the room, the councilwoman raised her hand, her voice even but distant. "Given the resource constraints and the current needs of the department, are there any objections to Officer Scout's removal from duty?" Silence answered her, a kind of consent by absence. Frank did not stand. He did not argue. He only reached down and let his palm settle against Scout's side, feeling the dog's ribs move with each breath. He remembered suddenly the sound Scout made as a pup, a sharp, hopeful yip, hungry for belonging. The official forms were passed down the line, the stamp pad brought out and pressed to the paper, unsuitable for duty. The sound of the stamp was sharp in the quiet. Scout shifted, as if sensing the change, his head lowering, eyes drifting closed. For a moment, the room felt airless. The only sound, the slow ticking of the clock above the door. It was then that Dr. Judith Lane entered, coat unbuttoned, hair escaping its braid. She carried herself with a kind of quiet determination, her movements gentle, deliberate. Judy stood for a long moment just inside the door, her gaze taking in the circle of officials, the sea of unreadable faces, and finally, Scout and Frank at the edge of the room. She did not say a word. Instead, as she moved past the others, she paused by Scout. She knelt, an old woman lowering herself with the grace of habit, and placed her small hand, cool and steady, on the shepherd's broad back. She stayed that way for a heartbeat or two, her presence a benediction in a room that had forgotten gentleness. No one spoke. No one moved. The moment was quiet, full of the things that could not be said. Judy rose, her hand lingering a second longer on Scout's fur, then touched Frank's shoulder as she passed, a silent reassurance. Frank looked up at her, his eyes rimmed with fatigue and something older, deeper. He found for a moment that he could breathe again. The meeting ended with no celebration, no anger, only a hollow kind of relief. Frank gathered the leash and rose. Scout followed, slow and dignified, casting one long look back at the place where his fate had been decided without a single word from him. As Frank led him from the room, the sound of footsteps and shifting chairs faded into memory. All that remained was the quiet bond between man and dog, tested and tempered by loss, a silence stronger than any verdict. Scout was transferred that afternoon to the small, aging animal holding facility attached to the town's only veterinary clinic. The place had the feel of a space between worlds, part hospital, part afterthought, the walls washed in a color that could never decide if it was cream or gray. Outside, the winter wind worried at the metal fencing, tugging bits of litter and dry leaves into corners. Inside, the light was thin, filtered through frosted windows, painting every surface with the hush of late afternoon. They put Scout in a corner run, away from the other animals. There was no sound except the mechanical click of the heater, the slow drip of a tap somewhere out of sight, the gentle rustle when the shepherd circled his blanket. Frank came that first evening after the shift, wearing his uniform though the badge felt heavier than ever before. He carried, bundled under his arm, the faded blue wool scarf that had once belonged to his wife, her initials still embroidered in a neat, looping hand near one edge. In his pocket was a crust of sourdough from the bakery, the kind Scout liked best. The door closed with a sigh behind him. Frank stood by the pen for a long while, hands in his coat, watching the shepherd as if afraid to disturb a fragile peace. Scout did not rise, but his ears twitched, tracking Frank's steps, nose moving as he scented the familiar. Slowly, Frank knelt, threading the scarf through the wire until it lay on the blanket. Scout nosed it, pausing, then settled his chin onto the wool, as if it offered him a piece of home. No words passed between them. There was nothing left to say. Frank visited every day, sometimes before sunrise, sometimes long after night had fallen and the streets of Pendleton had emptied out. Each time he found Scout waiting, not alert, but not broken, simply enduring. as if the act of waiting itself was a kind of work. Sometimes Frank would bring the old battered thermos, the same he used for his wife's grave, and sit outside the pen, sipping coffee that went cold too fast, talking softly about things he barely understood, the weather, the news, a memory from before the world grew so small. He told stories, not for Scout, not even for himself, but as a way to fill the space, to mark the passing of hours. Sometimes he recited bits of poetry, the lines his wife had loved. Sometimes he simply sat, letting the silence press around them until it felt less like absence and more like companionship. The holding area was never busy, but always full of quiet movement. Dr. Judy Lane visited at odd hours, her footsteps soft, voice never raised. She checked Scout's chart, refilled the water bowl, sometimes lingering to smooth the fur along the shepherd's battered neck. She rarely spoke directly to Frank, but her presence was a balm. She treated the animal's eyes, rinsing the ruined socket, applying ointment with gentle hands, murmuring small comforts that Scout responded to in a way only the wounded can understand. For both man and dog, Judy's presence was a gentle assertion. You are seen, you are not yet abandoned. Other people came and went, a young tech named Alyssa, whose nervous energy filled the gaps, a janitor humming old country songs as he swept, a little girl who brought a painted rock and slipped it through the wire, whispering for luck. None stayed long, but in the small gestures, an extra blanket, a slice of cheese tucked in with dinner, a window opened just enough to let in the smell of snow, Scout found a mosaic of kindness, fragile but real. Nights were hardest. The wind rose, rattling the windows, making the chain link shiver. Scout would sometimes stand, restless, circling his pen as if searching for a door that no longer existed. Frank, sitting on the concrete outside, would watch the dog's silhouette, backlit by the hallway light, and remember all the places they'd been together. The ridges, the creek beds, the long silent patrols through fields flecked with moonlight. When exhaustion finally dragged Frank home, the walk to his empty house felt heavier than it ever had. He left the TV off, the lights dim, moving through the rooms as if visiting a place half remembered. Sometimes he would take down the old photo albums, Scout as a puppy, his wife in the garden, his son laughing at a picnic table, and lay them on the table, tracing the images with his fingers, as if memory itself could be called back from the cold. Each day, the threat of finality grew nearer. Frank could feel it in the polite distance of his colleagues, in the perfunctory way the officers signed off on Scout's paperwork, in the way the chief avoided his gaze. No one was unkind. They simply disappeared from around him, leaving Frank and his dog in the narrowing orbit of waiting. One evening, as Frank sat outside the pen, Scout nudged the sourdough crust against his hand, a small insistence. Frank broke off a piece and pushed it through the wire. Scout took it carefully, chewing slow, eyes never leaving Frank's face. For a long time they sat that way, dusk deepening, the world shrinking to the sound of quiet breathing and the distant, steady drip of water in the pipes. Judy appeared at the end of the hall, hands in her pockets, watching the scene. She offered Frank a nod, then entered the pen, crouching beside Scout. Her fingers brushed the old scarf, smoothing the folds. "He remembers," she said, almost to herself. "They always do." Frank did not reply, but as he stood to leave, Scout pressed his nose to the back of Frank's hand, a gesture of trust, a promise made with no need for words. And in that moment, the distance between loss and hope seemed, just for a heartbeat, less impossible. Waiting, after all, was its own kind of faith. The night before the hearing arrived in a hush that felt too still, as if even the wind had agreed to keep its secrets. Clouds pressed close to the town, heavy and unmoving, their shadows blanketing the hills in blue darkness. The animal clinic, with its humming fluorescent lights and echoing tile corridors, felt even more remote, a refuge for the lonely and the waiting. Frank came late. The day had worn him down, each hour ticking away with the slow ache of worry. He moved with the heaviness of a man carrying not only the weight of the world, but the memory of every loss it had ever given him. In his hands, he carried nothing, just the silence that had settled on him since morning. A silence Scout seemed to recognize the moment Frank appeared in the hallway. Scout was curled on his blanket, the scarf still tucked beneath his chin. The dog's breathing was shallow, his sides moving with a stutter that Frank had not heard before. He knelt at the pen's edge, fingers curling through the wire, voice little more than a thread. "Easy, Scout," he murmured, the words falling into the hush like stones in water. But tonight, something was different. Scout's muscles tensed and shook, his body rigid, eyes wide in the half-light. Then, with a suddenness that startled them both, a tremor ran through the shepherd, his legs kicking out, his chest heaving, mouth drawn back in a soundless cry. A seizure, not long, but enough to send a cold spike of fear through Frank's spine. He fumbled with the latch, his hands unsteady, and in the next moment, Dr. Judy Lane appeared at his side. She had been reviewing charts in the back room, her own thoughts heavy and scattered when she heard the commotion. Judy's experience with wounded creatures ran deep. She knelt swiftly beside Scout, her hands sure and gentle as she steadied the dog, one palm on his chest, the other stroking along his spine. Frank found himself beside her, holding Scout's paw, murmuring the same low, nonsense comforts he'd once used to soothe his son after nightmares. For a few endless minutes, the world contracted to the narrow circle of light around them. The old man, the old woman, and the battered dog, their breaths rising and falling in sync, 3 heartbeats stubbornly refusing to let go. When the worst of it passed, Scout lay still, chest fluttering, eyes unfocused but searching for the familiar. Frank pressed his forehead to the shepherd's, closing his eyes, letting the old pain find him again. He thought of all the nights he'd sat like this, beside a hospital bed, beside a graveside, beside a dog who'd never learned to give up. Judy was the first to break the silence, her voice low and steady. Sometimes the old wounds come back like this, even when we think we've learned to live with them. She looked at Frank, her eyes catching the small tremor in his hands, the tiredness that lived behind his stoic posture. For a long while, neither spoke. They sat with Scout between them, listening to the hum of the building, the sound of rain beginning to tap softly at the window. Frank finally found his voice, rough and barely above a whisper. "He saved me once, you know. Saved more than just my life." Judy nodded. "That's what they do. They fill in the cracks, carry the burdens we don't even know we have." He watched her then, really looked, saw in her face the same weariness, the same old pain folded deep beneath the surface. He remembered suddenly the story others had told, how Judy had come to Pendleton after losing her son overseas, how she'd made the clinic her haven, filling it with the broken and the lost, because she understood, in some wordless way, what it was to need saving. Her hand stayed on Scout's side. She spoke softly, almost as if to herself. "I never believed it, the way some people do, that every pain is meant for a reason. But I know this much. Letting go doesn't mean you stopped loving. It just means you loved enough to let someone rest." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the truth of it land quietly inside him. settling alongside all the other aches he carried. The seizure passed, leaving Scout weak but calm. Judy helped Frank lift him, nestling the shepherd into the blanket again, tucking the scarf around his neck with the care one gives a child after a fever. They stayed for a while, neither willing to break the fragile peace that had settled. In that small, dim room, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and rain, there was no bravado, no pleading with fate, only the stubborn presence of two people and a dog, bearing witness to each other's struggle. When it came time to leave, Judy walked Frank to the door, her coat pulled tight, hair escaping in loose gray wisps. "You don't have to be alone in this," she said, voice a gentle firmness. "Grief doesn't make you weak. It just means you remember what mattered." Frank managed a smile, tired, grateful, a little crooked at the edges. "Thank you, Judy." Outside, the night had grown heavier, the town swallowed by mist and rain. Frank paused, looking back at the glowing window of Scout's room, the silhouette of the dog barely visible, head resting on the blue scarf. He realized then that he was afraid, not just of what tomorrow would bring, but of the empty places left behind if Scout were gone, afraid of losing, again, the silent companion who had filled so many hollow hours with quiet devotion. He stood in the parking lot for a long time, letting the rain find him, cold against his skin. Above the rooftops, thunder rolled, a sound ancient and indifferent. Inside, Scout slept, breathing soft, the scars hidden but never quite healed. And Frank, for all his years, was left with nothing but the hope that this time, just once, loyalty and love might be enough to hold back the dark. The morning arrived buried beneath a shroud of snow. Pendleton transformed, the hills and roofs softened beneath an endless quilt of white. Each flake settled gently, muffling the world's noise, as if the town itself had paused to hold its breath. The clinic's windows glowed softly in the blue hush before sunrise, frost tracing fragile rivers down the glass. For a moment, the world outside felt suspended, its harshness hushed by cold and quiet. Frank came early, boots crunching through untouched drifts. His breath curled in the air as he reached the clinic door, pausing to knock the snow from his coat. The old ache in his knees reminded him of other winters, of a younger man's stubbornness, of days when he believed endurance was the only measure of love. He stepped inside, stamping warmth back into his feet, and moved down the quiet hallway where only the hum of the radiators and the distant click of Judy's shoes marked the hour. Scout was awake, curled into a tight circle on his blanket, one ear cocked, his good eye tracing the shaft of morning light creeping across the floor. He did not rise, but when Frank knelt at the edge of the pen, the dog lifted his head and pressed it against the wire, a silent greeting. Frank reached through, gloved hand gentle on Scout's battered skull, thumb absently following the ridge of scar. He let himself rest there, the heat of the shepherd's breath warming his palm, the old rituals anchoring him to the moment. Outside, the snow thickened. The town moved at half speed, plows grumbling, headlights cutting tunnels through the fog. For Frank, the white silence pulled him backward, past the ache of last night, past the dull dread of what lay ahead. Memory, once summoned, came vivid as breath. It was a winter like this one, years earlier. The call came just before dark, a landslide on the East Road, a hiker unaccounted for, the first real storm of the season turning the hills into a maze of shifting drifts. Frank and Scout answered without question. He remembered the way the snow battered the windshield, the way Scout trembled with readiness in the back seat, alert to the scent of crisis before any human could sense it. The search had been slow and methodical, each step up the frozen ridge a negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. The snow swallowed all but the nearest world, sky and ground merging into a blind infinity. Frank's voice had gone hoarse from calling, his hands numb on the flashlight. Scout worked in widening circles, nose low, ignoring the sting of wind, his body cutting silent paths through thigh-high drifts. They found the hiker at the bottom of a ravine, half buried, cold already setting into bone. Scout reached him first, barking once, sharp and insistent. Frank scrambled after, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Together, man and dog wrestled the man from the snow's grip, wrapping him in a blanket, radioing for rescue. The wind shrieked up the gully. The world shrank to their three bodies, all heat and hope and desperate movement. The way back up was a blur. Frank remembered slipping, the world tilting beneath him. The ground shifted, a muffled crack, then silence. The next moments had never left him. Scout pressing against his chest, teeth catching the sleeve of his coat, dragging him inch by stubborn inch toward the lip of the ravine. The shepherd's good eye gleamed fierce in the blowing snow, his body a barrier against the cold. Frank remembered lying there, cheek pressed to ice, the world spinning, breath ragged. Scout, half buried, refused to leave, whining low, licking Frank's face until the man stirred. That night, they both made it home. Frank's wife had wrapped Scout in towels, coaxing warmth back into stiff limbs, her voice a litany of gratitude and worry. Frank had sat on the kitchen floor, hands tangled in Scout's fur, understanding in that silent hour what it meant to owe a life not to luck, but to loyalty. Now, in the clinic's quiet pen, Frank turned that old memory over and over, each detail bright and stinging. He unfastened the battered collar from around Scout's neck, the old leather, worn soft by years of use, the silver tag inscribed with a name nearly faded away. He ran his thumb over the letters, tracing each one as if reading a secret. He remembered all the nights Scout had stood guard over his brokenness. After his wife's death, when the world shrank to a single chair, a cup gone cold, the heavy silence at the door. In those nights, Scout had asked for nothing but presence curling close, a heartbeat in the dark. Frank clipped the collar back in place and let himself simply sit. The clinic around him faded. Outside, the snow drifted down, burying the sounds of the waking town. Scout, sensing the change, moved closer, his body pressed to the wire, breath fogging the space between them. Frank closed his eyes, let the grief and gratitude roll through him in equal measure. He realized what he had known all along. Scout did not need two eyes to see. He saw with the part of himself that could never be ruined, the heart that, for all its wounds, had never learned to stop loving. Somewhere in the building, Judy's voice drifted soft as a lullaby, checking on the other animals. For a while, Frank and Scout remained, suspended in the hush of winter, memory and hope mingling in the thin blue light. Two old souls bound by everything they had survived, and all the quiet that lay ahead. The day of the hearing dawned with a brittle clarity, the sky scrubbed pale by wind and the hush of recent snow. Pendleton's streets glistened in the morning sun, ice caught in every rut and hollow, light scattering in quiet prisms along the courthouse steps. The building itself was a relic, red brick softened by weather, heavy doors creaking at the hinges, inside always a degree colder than the world outside. Frank arrived with Scout at his side. The shepherd walked slowly, his step careful on the salt and grit, good eye flicking upward with every new sound. A few people lingered on the sidewalk, glancing over their shoulders as the pair passed. Most looked away, not out of unkindness, but out of the instinct to give privacy to what hurt. Inside, the courtroom was half lit, pews dusted with old sunlight, the faint tang of wood polish and aging paper hovering in the air. Only a handful of seats were occupied. 2 officers from the station, a clerk with her hair pinned too tightly, a maintenance worker in muddy boots. No one spoke above a whisper. Scout settled by Frank's feet as he took his place at the end of a long wooden bench, fingers unconsciously tracing circles on the dog's shoulder. The leash, though unnecessary, lay slack in his hand, a formality more than a restraint. Scout's head rested on Frank's boot, breathing slow and measured, listening in his own way for a verdict no words could soften. At the front, a paneled table marked the proceedings. On one side, a lawyer representing the city, her face drawn, lips set in a line that spoke of fatigue more than malice. Beside her, a young man in a pressed suit glanced repeatedly at a sheaf of documents, eyebrows pinched. Opposite them, a single chair waited for Frank, its wooden arms polished smooth by decades of restless hands. The judge, a woman in her late 60s, entered without ceremony. Her hair was clipped short and silver, eyes sharp, every movement deliberate. She took her place behind the bench, hands folded neatly, gaze passing briefly over the room before settling on Scout. She said nothing at first, simply regarded the shepherd, a moment's pause that carried its own kind of gravity. The proceedings began with the city's lawyer reading from a report. Her words were careful, clipped. Medical evaluations confirm that the canine, Scout, is no longer fit for duty. Loss of visual acuity, behavioral changes post-injury, episodes of disorientation. The risk, according to assessment, is now deemed significant. Financial and operational constraints make continued care unfeasible. She listed each point with the detached efficiency of someone reciting a grocery list. As she spoke, the young man beside her handed over documents, medical charts, department memos, expense reports with red numbers in the margins. Frank listened, his jaw set, one hand resting on Scout's back. The lawyer's voice faded in and out against the rhythm of his memories, the storm, the rescue, the years of service given in silence and devotion. No one in the room had been there on the ridge, in the whiteout. No one but Scout had pulled him back from the edge. When the city's case ended, silence fell, a vacancy where argument usually lives. The judge cleared her throat. "Officer Weller, is there anything you wish to add?" Frank met her gaze, then shook his head slowly. He did not stand. He did not plead. He reached down, cupping Scout's head in both hands, letting the gesture speak the truth words could not hold. Scout's eyes, one cloudy, one bright, closed, a deep sigh trembling through his chest. It was Judy who broke the stillness, her footsteps soft against the old planks. She took her place near the bench, standing small but unyielding, her white coat bright against the somber wood. "If I may, Your Honor." The judge nodded. Judy did not read from notes. She did not need a file. She spoke plainly, voice steady as Riverstone. "I have known Scout since the day he arrived in Pendleton. I've watched him comfort frightened children, guide the lost home, keep lonely widows company in the evenings when their own breath was the only sound in the house. He has given more to this town than any ledger can hold." She paused, glancing at Frank, then back to the judge. "I know what it means to be measured by what you can no longer do. I lost a son in war. There are days I feel useless, days the pain leaves me stranded, but I also know healing doesn't look the same for everyone. Sometimes presence is enough. Sometimes the gentlest life is the one that keeps others afloat." Her words sank into the silence, filling the cracks with something warmer than hope, a stubborn insistence that value is not defined by utility. The city's lawyer looked down. The clerk dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. In the end, no testimony was needed from Frank. The truth, shared between a man and his battered dog, had already been written, in the worn places of a collar, in the gentle pressure of a head against a knee, in the soft hush of breath that is the measure of a life remembered. And as the hearing paused for deliberation, Scout lifted his head, pressing closer to Frank, the courtroom's light casting their two shadows as one along the old wooden floor. The room seemed to hold its breath after Judy's words, the echo of her voice still trembling in the woodwork. Snowlight filtered in through the high windows, painting pale ladders across the judge's bench and pooling in quiet around Scout and Frank. The old building felt, for a rare moment, less like a courtroom and more like a chapel, a place where grief and hope might sit quietly side by side. The judge reviewed the stack of reports in silence, glasses perched on the end of her nose. From time to time she glanced up, not at the lawyers, not at the files, but at the battered shepherd and the man beside him. Her face was thoughtful, not severe, the sort of look that comes from having lived through enough loss to recognize its many faces. The city's lawyer cleared her throat, offering a closing statement in measured tones, careful not to let her fatigue sound like pity. She repeated the phrase, "public safety," let it rest heavily in the space between the benches, and finished with a perfunctory, "We recommend the humane course." Frank listened, not to the words, but to the ache underneath them. His hand drifted to Scout's collar, the old leather worn soft, the metal tag dulled from years of touch. His thumb found the groove of the name stamped into silver. Scout. He turned it over, a ritual as familiar as breath. The judge set aside her papers and spoke quietly, not as a judge but as a person who has seen enough endings to know when a story should not be hurried. Before this court decides, is there anyone else who wishes to speak? Or anything? She paused, searching for the right word. That ought to be shown. Frank looked up, uncertain, searching the judge's face for an invitation that was not quite a command. Then, as if guided by something deeper than deliberation, he reached into his pocket and drew out Scout's old collar, the one that had circled the shepherd's neck the day he'd pulled Frank from the snow all those years ago. The leather was cracked, the tag nearly smooth, but the memory lived in every worn crease. He rose, the movement slow and deliberate, and approached the bench. The collar in his hand, he paused before the judge, offering it without words. She accepted it, turning it over in her palm, running a finger over the faded inscription, her eyes softening as she read the name. Frank spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but the room leaned in to catch every word. He found me in the storm, when I was lost and nearly gone. He couldn't see more than shadows then, but he found me, pulled me out, sat with me until the lights came through the snow. He paused, his gaze resting on Scout. He's been that light for a lot of people. You don't need two eyes to see what matters. You just need to stay. The judge nodded, a small gesture of understanding, then returned the collar to Frank. A silence, long and full, settled over the room. And then something quiet but remarkable unfolded. A small boy, no more than 7, with dark hair and wide, anxious eyes, sat on the end of a bench beside his mother. He had been fidgeting, chin tucked low, until Scout turned his head in the boy's direction. The shepherd sniffed the air, then slowly and with great effort, pulled himself to his feet and limped across the aisle. The courtroom, startled, parted to let him through. The boy's mother reached to steady him, but the child slid off the bench and stood very still as Scout approached. The dog paused, head low, and gently rested his muzzle on the boy's knee. The boy, trembling, reached down and placed his hands on Scout's scarred head. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the boy, face crumpling, began to cry. Not loudly, but with the shudder of a heart breaking open. He dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Scout's neck, burying his face in the shepherd's fur. Scout stood steady, eyes closed, his breathing calm. The judge watched, as did everyone else, something unspoken passing among them all, a memory perhaps, of their own moments of fear and comfort. No one interrupted. The mother knelt and gathered her son, her hands shaking, gratitude and something like relief in her eyes. Scout made his slow way back to Frank, settling by his side once more, the room holding its hush. The judge removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. When she spoke, her voice was steadier than before, but gentler too. Sometimes the truest proof is not in the record. It's in the small things. What we witness, what we remember. I will take all this under advisement. As the hearing closed, Frank knelt beside Scout and pressed his forehead to the shepherd's. He did not say thank you. He did not say goodbye. He simply breathed in the scent of old fur and leather, the trace of snow still lingering in memory. And for that moment, the promise between them, unspoken, forged in storm and silence, held against the weight of judgment and the world's uncertainty. Scout had done what he always did. He stayed. He was enough. The verdict came quietly, without drama or applause. The letter, signed with the judge's looping hand, arrived at Frank's doorstep 2 days after the hearing, folded and creased from its journey through the snowy streets. The official language was brief. Canine Scout, reassigned to community therapy, not subject to euthanasia order. Permanent retirement into private care authorized. But between each word was a kindness rarely found in such documents. A grace, a reprieve, a door cracked open to let in the thaw. Frank sat at his kitchen table, the letter spread before him, the kettle humming low on the stove. His hands, thick-fingered and chapped from winter, rested flat on the page. He read it 3 times, each reading slower than the last. When he finally let his head drop into his palms, it was not in weariness, but in a trembling, shattering relief. For a long time, he simply let himself breathe. That evening, the sky over Pendleton was streaked with the last copper of dusk. Frank drove out to the clinic for the final time as Scout's keeper in waiting, the old blue scarf folded neatly under his arm and a paper sack of treats in the passenger seat. The world seemed softer, the town's edges blunted by melting snow, sidewalks gleaming in the hush after sunset. Inside the clinic, Judy waited by the door. She wore her best cardigan, the one with moth holes at the cuffs, and her hair was caught up with a barrette shaped like a leaf. She didn't need to ask. The look in Frank's eyes, in the way his shoulders had shed their old tension, told her everything. "He's ready," she said, nodding toward the back. Frank crossed the familiar hallway, boots squeaking on clean tile, and found Scout waiting in the pen, already standing, tail swishing slowly, expectant but calm. Frank knelt and unlatched the door. Scout stepped forward, head pressing gently against Frank's chest, a long sigh leaving his body, as if the waiting, months and years of it, had finally ended. No words, just the careful way Frank wrapped the scarf around the shepherd's neck, a small act of ceremony, marking the passage from uncertainty to home. The three of them, Frank, Scout, and Judy, walked out into the cold evening light. The town seemed to notice them. A teenager at the bus stop waved. A shopkeeper across the street gave a thumbs up. Someone called, "Welcome back, Scout," from a window. Kindness had a way of finding its own echo. Judy stopped at her car, fumbling with her keys. "I'll come by tomorrow, check his stitches, bring some biscuits. He's always liked my baking more than my medicine." Her voice was warm, if a little unsteady. Frank nodded, gratitude shining in his tired face. "He'll like that," he managed, voice rough. Scout, as if to seal the promise, gave Judy's hand a gentle nudge, then turned back to Frank, his good eye bright and attentive. They walked together along the sidewalk, following the riverbank where the Umatilla curved through town, the water high and restless with melt. Scout moved slow, a slight limp in his gait. But with every step he seemed to reclaim a little more of the world. Frank kept pace, hand trailing through the shepherd's fur, the two of them casting twin shadows in the golden lamplight. At home, the old house was quiet, the air tinged with the scent of wood smoke and boiled coffee. Frank spread a blanket by the hearth and coaxed Scout to settle, the dog's head coming to rest on his knee as Frank stoked the fire. He sat there for a long while, letting the warmth and the ordinary peace seep into the corners of the room. Judy's promise held. She arrived the next morning, a tin of biscuits under her arm and a gentle smile at the ready. Together they checked Scout's bandages, brushed his coat, and watched him nose around the living room, inspecting every familiar shadow, reacquainting himself with home. Scout's world was smaller now. No more racing through snowdrifts, no more endless fields to patrol. But in that shrinking was a kind of freedom, a gentleness Frank had never known in all his years behind a badge. The days fell into a new rhythm. Scout became a presence in the neighborhood, padding alongside Frank on slow walks through the park, pausing for children who wanted to stroke his fur, or for old men who sat on benches, hungry for quiet company. Judy visited often, sometimes with her own aches hidden in the pockets of her coat, sometimes simply to share coffee and a story or two. They made an unlikely trio, an old man, an older dog, and a woman with sorrow and hope stitched into every line of her face. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the river's edge, Frank, Scout, and Judy walked together along the water. Scout's head lifted to the wind, one eye closed against the brightness, the other wide and curious. The air was sweet with thaw, and the grass at the water's edge showed the first hints of green. Frank looked down at Scout, who pressed close and felt, for the first time in years, something shifting inside him. A quiet loosening, a space where joy might find its way back. In that open door, with the river's song and the world washed new by forgiveness, a battered shepherd walked at his side, seeing everything that mattered. And Frank, learning at last the lesson of patience and love, let the morning come. The seasons turned quietly in Pendleton, as if the town itself understood that some wounds required time and patience to knit together again. Spring crept in with a softness nearly invisible, green threading through brown fields, the river loosening its grip on ice, light growing longer in the evenings, gilding the old rooftops and silent gravestones. The air, once sharp and cold, now carried the scent of grass and distant lilac. The change did not arrive all at once, but in gentle increments, as healing often does. In the town square, a new rhythm settled in, a life shaped not by urgency, but by presence. Scout became a fixture on the benches and the grassy patch beneath the old willow. He was not the bounding, tireless rescuer of his youth. Instead, he moved with quiet dignity, his limp steady, one eye closed in perpetual rest, the other alert and gentle. Children gravitated to him with the unthinking trust of the very young, drawn by the peacefulness that seemed to radiate from the battered shepherd. Some would sit for hours, fingers weaving through Scout's thick fur, whispering their worries or stories no grown-up would ever hear. Elderly men and women, many living alone, their children grown or gone, paused during their errands to rest beside Scout, finding comfort in the heat of his body, the way he leaned into a tired hand, the soft sigh that seemed to understand loneliness without ever naming it. Scout did not bark, nor chase, nor beg for affection. He offered only his silent company, his presence a quiet promise. You are not forgotten, not here. Frank, too, felt the change. The tightness in his chest that had lived there since his wife's death began to ease, little by little, with each morning's coffee brewed for two instead of one, with every walk to the river and back, with the gentle sound of Scout's paws padding from room to room. The house, once echoing with loss, grew full again, not of noise but of the small, sustaining rituals of life, the rattle of kibble in the bowl, the whir of Judy's laugh over shared pie, the tap of Scout's tail against the floorboards when Frank entered the room. Judy flourished, too, in the afterglow of survival. She started a weekly class in the community center, teaching children and their families how to care for animals, how to listen, how to notice the difference between loneliness and silence, between patience and pain. Scout was always her silent assistant, lying at the front of the room, receiving gentle pats and uncertain hugs from children who, for their own reasons, sometimes felt like outsiders. His presence made the lessons easier, softer. The children saw themselves in his scars and learned to be gentle with him and with themselves. It became a local custom for visitors to Pendleton to seek out the one-eyed shepherd in the square. Some came with burdens they could not name, others simply with curiosity. All left a little lighter. There were rumors, spoken in the way only small towns can, that Scout could sense sorrow before a word was spoken, that he would settle beside those who needed him most, offering no judgment, just warmth and gravity and the fragile, ordinary miracle of being seen. Frank watched all of this with a grateful heart, sometimes surprised by how life had become not smaller, but more meaningful in its narrowing. He learned, at last, the value of each quiet afternoon, the gift of slow days unbroken by crisis. He walked with Scout every evening down to the river's edge, where the world grew still and the sky changed color. Sometimes Judy joined them, her steps soft, her stories looping through dusk and memory. On these walks, Frank understood the lesson that had taken him so long to learn, that some things, love, loyalty, the silent companionship of a dog with a battered heart, are not less for their brokenness. The world measures value by utility, by what can be given or done or accomplished. But here on the riverbank in the fading light, Frank saw that the true measure of a life is how it touches others, quietly, gently, with presence. Scout, for all his scars, had become not a symbol of loss, but of belonging. He had stitched together a web of kindness in the little town, child to elder, lonely heart to lonely heart. And in his simple, enduring presence, Scout taught Pendleton the most important lesson of all: light, however small, finds its way through the cracks. As the sun dipped low, Frank stood with his hand resting on Scout's shoulder, Judy at his side, the river shining with gold. Around them, laughter drifted through the square, the sounds of life moving forward, never erasing sorrow, but illuminating it, making room for hope to grow. And so it was that, in the quiet grace of a dog's patience and a town's gentle embrace, The wounded became healers. The forgotten became cherished. And each day began again with the lesson of light. That kindness, steadfast and unremarkable, is always enough to guide us home. When we open our hearts to those who've been wounded, whether man or dog, we become part of a quiet miracle. In Scout's journey, we learn that dignity can survive loss, and that healing often comes not from grand gestures, but from the steady kindness of simply staying. Maybe your life, too, carries scars no one sees. Maybe you've known loneliness, or found unexpected comfort in the companionship of a friend, a pet, or a stranger who reached out at just the right moment. If you believe that no life is ever truly forgotten, and that even in brokenness there's a light that leads us home, type Amen in the comments, or share the name of a loyal companion who's changed your life. What part of Scout's story touched you most? Have you ever found hope when you thought all was lost? Tell us where you're watching from. And if you'd like, share your own story below. Your words may be the gentle light someone else needs to find their way tonight. Thank you for listening and for being part of this circle of kindness. If this story meant something to you, share it with a friend. And remember, sometimes a second chance is all it takes to change everything.